Did you know even judges, the people we most expect to demonstrate fair, objective opinions, are biased? Everyone holds stereotypes that unconsciously affect their behaviors, decisions, and lives. These stereotypes that we unconsciously hold but cannot actively recall are called implicit biases. They can become a problem as we may project values that don't even align with our own beliefs and bring others down in the process. What do I mean by that? Someone may be speaking of a scientist. Let's call this person Dr. Johnson. I can tell you that Dr. Johnson is a world-renowned physicist doing cutting-edge research on nuclear physics and is the head of a huge corporation. Who are you picturing right now? Did you think of Dr. Johnson as a minority? Did you consider the possibility of Dr. Johnson being a woman? If you didn't picture Dr. Johnson like this, and I asked you why, would you be able to give an explanation? When we unconsciously associate people with certain attributes, we are demonstrating implicit bias. As Penn Staters, we value community, helping one another, and putting our best foot forward. We have an opportunity to make Penn State an even better environment than what it already is, and send our alumni out into the world better equipped to improve it. I propose that we integrate implicit bias training into freshman courses for all students. But before examining a solution, we must understand implicit biases and its causes. Implicit bias is a stereotype or association that we hold subconsciously but cannot recall. As published in University of Denver's Microaggressions in the Classroom article, it can take the form of brief verbal and environmental indignities, insensitivity, or negating the feelings and experiences of a certain person or group. When we express our implicit biases, we create an unwelcoming environment, and the negative effects propagate onward. In his publication, College Teaching, educational researcher Guy Boysen described how 63% of students witness subtle bias in the classroom. Through these experiences, students who witness implicit bias perceive campus climate negatively, have physical and psychological health stress, and can experience an inability to exert cognitive effort in the classroom. This means implicit bias is a widespread problem in education and likely presents itself here at Penn State, which unfortunately means our students may not be in the best possible environment they can. Overall, our peers' health, grades, and lives could be better if it weren't for implicit bias. That's not to say implicit bias doesn't affect our professors as well. In addition to these effects, professors also witness problems due to implicit bias in teacher ratings. Colleen Flaherty, a reporter for Inside Higher Education, provided experimental research on the effects of gender bias on student-teacher evaluations at Iowa State. The research showed that gender bias against women made female professor ratings lower than male professor ratings. However, when language cautioning about unconscious bias of race and gender was used in the instructions for the evaluation, female professor ratings went up, while male professor ratings remained the same. This raises the question, are our faculty being evaluated, hired, and promoted on the basis of biases we, as students, don't consciously hold? What causes this implicit bias? From a young age, we look for patterns, whether that be in shapes or in people. Simply Psychology's article on implicit or unconscious bias explains that recognizing patterns and creating associations is how our brain lessens the cognitive load of the surroundings. Psychologist Mahzarin Banaji, who helped come up with the theory of implicit bias in 1995, further explained the roots of implicit bias in an interview with NPR, stating, "Implicit bias is in the culture in which we live. There is a culture that has led men to being surgeons and women being nurses. If you had lived in a culture where the opposite happened, you would have the opposite bias. Overall, we develop biases by taking in information and forming inaccurate associations as shortcuts. These biases are then reinforced through constant exposure of events or media portrayals that match. So how can we use this habitual pattern of our brains to our advantage? By introducing and repetitively reinforcing the negative effects of implicit bias, we could become more aware of our own implicit biases as well as our peers. Penn State can implement implicit bias training in the first-year seminar courses and engagement plans. Over the span of the course, students will first receive a presentation defining what implicit bias is and how it occurs. They will then participate in discussions where they can share either experienced or witnessed implicit bias personally or in the media. As a tool to help students recognize where they may hold implicit bias, students will take Harvard's Implicit Bias test online. Results can be kept to themselves, and an anonymous reporting system can be used to give general data to course instructors. In having students see their results from this test, there may be concern about students responding defensively to results suggesting they have bias. This is a valid concern that we would try to minimize through two preparations at the beginning of the course. The first being the original exposure presentation, emphasizing how implicit bias does not necessarily align with our views. The second, having the prior discussions with peers about experiences of implicit bias to see how widespread it is, and even exhibited in respectable people. Furthermore, the implicit bias test is already used for similar reasons in some courses, such as SC 220, a pedagogy class for learning assistants in STEM at Penn State. On the PBS website, in an article entitled "Making People Aware of Their Implicit Biases Doesn't Usually Change Minds," Betsy Mason pointed out that revealing to people that they have implicit bias does not mitigate it in the long run. For this reason, after revealing where people may have implicit biases, students will also be informed on how to address implicit bias effectively and respectfully. In his research, Boysen also explained how actively addressing occurrences of implicit bias in the classroom, as opposed to just ignoring them, makes for a more positive learning environment and helps to squander the presence of implicit bias. Students can practice this using the tools of effectively addressing implicit bias they learned in the course. This practicing will in turn help students more naturally become aware of implicit bias, and it will become more absent in the classroom. In order to reach this end goal of minimizing implicit bias at Penn State, this discussion is just the beginning. We need to recognize that implicit bias negatively affects grades, evaluations, and the health of people who comprise our Penn State community. This problem may have begun outside of Penn State when we were young, but we now have the opportunity to help resolve it by educating our students on implicit bias. I propose we implement implicit bias training in first-year seminar courses and engagement activities. We are Penn State. Let's ensure that everyone feels like they are included in we. Let's stop implicit bias. Thank you.